So the Supreme Court in the States just upheld affirmative action. Affirmative action is actually constitutionally protected in Canada, but it's our Constitution has something like an equal amendment right that says that bans any sort of discrimination on any sort of specified grounds and analogous grounds to the ones that are specified, right? Except in situations that are designed to be ameliorative, right? So you can't discriminate on race except when it's to help someone based on race. That's affirmative action, and it's in our Constitution. Doesn't really apply to Africans. It's more like for Indigenous people here. That's the big thing. And is it necessary for Indigenous people here? Yeah, it is. If we conclude it's working, right? So, like, for us, the question is not, like, it's written right into our Constitution that we ban discrimination except for ameliorative purposes. But note that we're kind of conceding the point with the language, right? We're acknowledging, like, our Constitution implicitly acknowledges that affirmative action is discriminatory, but it allows it constitutionally in ameliorative purposes. And in fact, that's not far from my perspective. Who wrote that? It was Poppy Trudeau, the current Prime Minister's father. I mean, I don't know who wrote exactly what parts of it, but he was the primary framer. He and some staffers and some cabinet ministers around him. But what do I think about this? Well, I don't like affirmative action either, frankly. And I say either because the comment that I'm reacting to doesn't really support it, and a lot of the comments on the video are very opposed to it. Again, this is like the Young Turks. It's just like a stream of right-wing hate. Like, you gotta wonder. Sometimes I wonder if he's like doing some kind of like reverse psychology programming or something. It seems kind of weird sometimes. It has an absolutely valid. Well, actually, let's go watch my video on the psychologists. I got some red flags coming from that site. I'm not throwing any accusations at it or anything. It's just something seems not right. But I mean, affirmative action has an absolutely valid critique from the left, and it does. I think it's a kind of a short-term necessity. I've made both arguments about whether this necessity has run its course, and don't really have a strict opinion on it. I would love to wake up one day and say we don't need affirmative action anymore, but what is clear is that this day is upon us. What is less clear is if we made progress or not, and whether this is really the right approach. If we cannot expect progress to come from it, I think the approach should be abandoned and we should try something else. So does that mean I'm opposed to the Canadian Constitution? Not really. Because the Canadian Constitution doesn't put down any specific rules or any specific quotas. It just says that discrimination is not allowed except, and remember that the Constitution works at a government level, right? There's a human rights code and it's more or less the same, but it's human rights codes are enforceable by fine, right? It's not like, we can't tell people what to think, right? We can just, tell them that there's penalties, if you're going to be an asshole, right? Our Constitution, there's nothing in our Constitution that would prevent, like, let's say 100 years from now, Canada is a majority Asian country, and white people are an oppressed minority. Look at the demographic trends, right? It's not so crazy. I think that the demographics in the states suggest that the white population might be around 30% in 100 years, or less than that, which is roughly, I think, what the black population is now. Something close to it. A flipperoo. Numbers don't imply power, right? Just because the numbers flip around doesn't mean the power is going to, but still, it's not outside the realm of possibility, anyways. So let's say that happens, right? 100 years from now, it's country's overrun by Chinese, and whites are, we're building light rail across the country. We're building bullet train tracks across the country. All right. Our Constitution doesn't specify anything about skin color one way or the other. If the situation flips so that white people are the minority, then affirmative action for white people would be constitutionally allowed if it's for ameliorative purposes, right? Well, what our Constitution does is it puts down a set of rules, and it says if it's applicable, right? And then the judge has to rule on it. The judge has to rule, okay, acknowledging that this is discriminatory, is it ameliorative? If it's ameliorative, then it's okay. If it's not, then it's discriminatory, right? And that is the question that you need to ask on a case-by-case basis, right? So not only am I not opposed to the Constitution, that's exactly what I'm saying, right? So as a social libertarian, I simply can't agree that this is ideal or an acceptable structural concession of the way society ought to operate. I think it's best to break this down into three options. One is the status quo into perpetuity, and a society is always permanently racist. Racism is normal, and we need permanent structural means to balance it out. That would mean we should have affirmative action forever. I don't think so. I reject that in the most forceful terms possible. So at some point we gotta get rid of this, right? I don't mean get rid of this in the abstract. We should, withhold the option to go back to it, but as enforceable rules, we'll have to get rid of it eventually, right? Second option is that society is temporarily racist and affirmative action is helping us make things better. We're not at the point where we can get rid of it yet, but we're seeing some progress and we should stick with it a little longer, so long as we keep in mind that the end goal of eventually abolishing it is. I can live with that if the evidence upholds it, right? So if you look at the evidence and you're like, we still got a long ways to go, but look, we can point to this, it's demonstrably better. The number of, the unemployment rate amongst blacks has gone down. Of course, it hasn't actually, right? But, if you could point to that, if you had solid data that showed it was effective, it was working, great. We're not there yet. I don't really like it as a policy, but it's working. Let it run its course, and then we can get rid of it when it's done, right? The third option is that, okay, society is temporarily racist. Racism isn't inherent in people. It's not human nature, okay? But this affirmative action thing is not helping us. It's not making things better. In fact, there's been no appreciable change in social attitudes or hiring practices. Employers simply see it as a burden, try to circumvent the law as much as possible, and ultimately want to go back to openly racist hiring policies. And I unfortunately think that that's probably a lot closer to the truth of it. Well, then we need to look at the situation more carefully and be like, well, we put our ideals on hold. We compromised because we thought that this approach would help. It's not helping. So why are we holding to this thing that doesn't work? Maybe we need to try something else. Again, I think the first option is wrong. It's just an ideological argument. I don't accept that racism is normal or inevitable, so I refuse to accept the perpetual necessity of a policy that is only even worth discussing because it is ameliorative. Despite liking the fact that the way the Constitution is worded, because you can look at it on a face-by-face basis, and you will acknowledge that, even if it is ameliorative, then it's still discrimination, but it might be acceptable discrimination because it's ameliorative. Discrimination is not necessarily wrong. Discrimination can be okay if it's overturning a balance of power. But you need to check on a case-by-case basis that it really is overturning that balance of power. I'm a social libertarian, right? I'm sorry. I don't like it. If it's working, great. It's a necessary evil, but it's still evil, right? So it's the other two options that I'm torn, right? I want to believe the second option because I want to believe things are getting better. I just want to believe, right? But is that going to be a thing whenever I say I want to believe? But I mean, I know that the third option is actually closer to what the data says, right? Which is not to concede any ground to the fuckers, other than to point out that the fuckers are hard-headed fuckers. We tried to force them to not be fuckers, and they're still fuckers. The court made a choice here. I'm not convinced that the evidence upholds it. The thing is, like, where's the person with a better idea? You know, let us look. Let's set our heads to the hillsides and look in the distance for the individual with the better idea. You know, and always see our tumbleweeds, right? Normally when you put a policy in place, it comes with an assessment period at the end of it. What have the effects been? Has this policy been effective? If so, what have we learned that can improve it? If not, what ideas? What are other ideas that might? If not, what other ideas exist that might work better? That's what the debate should be at this point, right? It's what? 45 years later. But the issue is stuck at the political phase because opponents never really accepted it, so advocates never really stopped fighting for it. It's just this perpetual culture war, right? And it serves the political masters because, instead of fighting, the bastards, the bankers, they're fighting over this, right? Like, this is a class issue, and it should, and they've got you fighting over race, right? So this is exactly what they want, right? We're decades into it now. It's really time to stop and evaluate. And listen, I say this with no great happiness, but I'm sorry. I think that a really careful analysis of the data is going to show that affirmative action has not helped the groups it was meant to help. And so, besides the ideological debates about it, we need to ask, what else can we do to help the groups that need help? Because this isn't helping. Right?